There's an old Far Side panel by Gary Larson. Do you all remember when there were newspapers and there were comic strips in the newspapers? Some of them were just one panel. Some were both. Gasoline Alley started out as one panel, became a long-running multi-panel serial in which the characters aged in real time, with the result that some of them are now like 120 years old. The immortal Walt Wallet. Who would ever want to see Walt Wallet pass into the great beyond? Not I. At least not until he got to go back to early Victorian England and meet Herbert Pocket in the Great Gasoline Alley Great Expectations crossover, Great Gasoline Expectations Alley. You know this podcast has its sights set right on the top of the charts because we lead off on a baseball show primarily with a comic strip that began in 1918 and a book from 1855, 1860, I don't know, that some of you felt punished having to read in high school. I enjoyed it. And the David Lean film adaptation with a young Sir Alec Guinness, by which I mean he was 32 as opposed to Obi-Wan. That's a name I have not heard. Yeah, that movie's good too. It's from 1946. So just to bring you up to date, we've got a comic strip still running from 1918, a book from about 1860 still being read, and a movie from 1946 that shows up on Turner Classics every now and again. So I guess it's still in circulation too. And that makes me relevant. Anyway, this one panel comic strip, kind of like the Family Circus, but intelligent, was captioned, "The Real Reason the Dinosaurs Became Extinct." What was it? He drew a bunch of dinos puffing away on cigarettes. And it's a funny joke, one that today strikes me as being very much of its time. Cigarettes were a huge public health concern back in the 1980s when everyone lit up everywhere. And I realize that in much of the rest of the world, it's still like that. However, in the United States, when I was growing up, something like half the people smoked. Men, women, dogs. Now it's like 20 or 25%. Depending on the state. I imagine some states are higher, actually. But what's odd about that is that there was, I guess, a publicity campaign that worked to affect a change in people's behavior just for once. Because although the link between cigarettes and cancer wasn't explicit until well after most of the public became hooked, it was clear right along that these were not good for you. The advertisements from the cigarette companies themselves, as you go through the decades and look at them, give that away in a rather strange way. You'll see an ad, usually in a newspaper or magazine, could be a radio ad, so people will actually be talking. But you might see Stan Musial or Ted Williams saying something like, "When I've got to go first to third on a single, I can't worry about my cigarette getting my wind. That's why I smoke Stinky Britches. You know Stinky Britches from the pink package." Not only does Stinky Britches have the abrasive flavor that you've come to know and love, it's grating on the jaw and raspy on the tongue, but besides that, Stinky Britches growers harvest only the finest tobacco. Tobacco that won't cause you to wheeze and puff as you try to go 180 feet around the bases. So take it from me, a member of the pennant-winning, I'm sorry, we never win the pennant, but Boston Red Sox, smoke Stinky Britches. Or you might see a more generic ad featuring a drawing of your kindly town physician, old Doc Barnes. "When I'm delivering a baby, it wouldn't be becoming for me to spit brown sputum into the open cervix of my patients. That's why I smoke Boxer Stains. Boxer Stains naturally contains less nicotine than the leading brand, which makes me less edgy and therefore I expectorate less as well. I've delivered over 15,000 babies in my town over the years, but thanks to Boxer Stains, they come into this world drier than they might otherwise have." I read those ads today, usually when I'm researching stories for this show, and I think, how did no one perceive the subtext? It's so obvious, but they didn't. They probably looked at each other and they said, "They say these Stinky Britches are pretty good. I think I'll try them." The same way they might have said, "Sal Hepatica toothpaste. That sounds like the brand for my teeth." But beginning in the 1980s and through the 1990s, somehow that changed and the public suddenly began to get the message, the Marlboro Man is a terminal case. And that's even though the Surgeon General's warning had been on the packages for a while by then. And a lot of us just didn't get hooked or gave up on it. Finally. It's very hard to get anyone to change their ways, even when their lives depend on it. I think to some extent we all know that from personal experience. But further, if you think about that panel, what killed the dinosaurs really? It's not that far from the truth. No, it wasn't a self-destructive habit like smoking that killed the dinosaurs. It was most likely a meteor crash that led to a huge environmental catastrophe, one which created conditions in which the planet Earth was no longer hospitable to many or most of the biota that lived on it. That is, they were confronted by a problem that was beyond their ability to solve or cope with. No, it wasn't self-inflicted, but that doesn't matter. It's not where the crisis starts or who started it, if it does indeed have an author, but how you deal with it and whether it gets away from you or not. And here's another thing. We think of those dinosaurs as being one big, happy reptilian family, even if they ate each other a lot of the time. The non-plant eaters, I mean. The age of the dinosaurs, but there wasn't one age of the dinosaurs. Within the age of the dinosaurs, there were other subperiods and a whole bunch of extinctions, not driven by meteors, but just by the story of that particular dino reaching its end. The really big sauropods, the brachiosaurs, the one we called Brontosaurus when I was a kid, apparently inaccurately, or maybe they just changed their major and were reclassified. Those critters and Tyrannosaurus rex never met. They lived millions of years apart. They were much further apart in time than the entire existence of human beings on this planet, I guess as opposed to other planets. That is the story of life on Earth. Here today, gone tomorrow. Don't assume human beings, people, are the peak, pinnacle, and conclusion of the story, because if you do, I have so many other predecessors of ours to show you. Where are they now? Hell of a question. In a vitrine in a museum quite often. I bring this up because it was the sort of thinking that went into my final Dead Player of the Day series post. Dead Player of the Day is done for the moment. No doubt we will have a third season at some point. Babe Ruth popped up. Free for all. It is out there on Patreon as we speak. The 100th post of this series was about the Babe. The random button on Baseball Reference chucked me into a box score from the Yankees 1920s run. And when it gives me a box score, I have a minimum of 18 players to choose from. Those are my personal rules. You might play this game differently than I do, but that's how I've always done it. And so I took the license to tell a story about one of the players in that box score, and I thought, what better player for the series finale or season finale than the Babe? I haven't done him yet. And what a challenge for this short format. And I really didn't know what I would say, but I found it as I went along, which is both the wonderfulness of the Babe, who contained multitudes and still does, and also of just the exercise of writing in general and why I love it so much, because you can start with nothing, and if you get on the right wavelength with your thoughts, you can end with something. Of course, that's in the eye of the beholder, and I leave that conclusion to you. Since the show, which you are now listening to, has many more listeners than listeners who also drop by Patreon, I would like to share what I wrote with you here. I began, as I have before here on the show, with a lyric from Jill Sobiel's 2000 song, Heroes. Why are all our heroes so imperfect? Heard Babe Ruth was full of malice. Lewis Carroll, I'm sure, did Alice. All the French joined the resistance after the war. Taking the sadly late and much lamented Miss Sobiel's points in reverse order, right on about the French. We'll never know about Lewis Carroll, but my personal instinct is no, he didn't. And no, absolutely not. George Herman Ruth was not a saint. He was pretty far from that, if you want to limit your definition of sainthood to live a chaste and abstemious life. But there doesn't seem to have been much about him that was malicious. Mistaken? Sure. He was angry sometimes, or mistaken, or a million other things, but he was, generally speaking, a good man. Now that feels like a risky thing to write about any public figure, but putting aside Ruth's consistent embrace of 6 of the 7 deadly sins, I'm cutting him a break on wrath, which wasn't what motivated him. He was fine. And when it comes to pride, envy, gluttony, lust, sloth, and greed, let him or her among us who hasn't experienced those feelings throw out the first pitch. It's difficult to think of something I can tell you about the Babe. Note, the Babe will suffice, like Elvis or Prince, that you haven't heard before or that I haven't spoken about on the show. That's almost the point in itself, yet it would be too glib to say that his personality and legacy still dominates the game. They do in a lot of ways. We just don't know. We're not aware of it. The American memory is spectacularly short. Just consider all the fudging the present administration does, not that it administrates so much, regarding what happened when, so that Joe Biden's presidency stretches all the way back to 2016 and continues on to the present day. He was somehow responsible for our maladroit handling of COVID and the ongoing debacle in Iran. Years ago, the association that runs Mount Vernon, George Washington's old spread, had to put up a visitor center with an introductory "Who the hell was George Washington?" film because too many school kids were showing up with no understanding of who he was, why he mattered, or if there'd even be lunch. That's the extent to which we have failed to transmit from generation to generation a kind of basic package of, "Welcome to America, young feller or young lady. This is what you have to know to be here and be part of the community." That was very intentional, in part because some of us can't agree on what should be in that package, what kind of knowledge should be contained, how nuanced that knowledge should be, and who should be included and left out. And then we demagogue that, and we say, well, that group of people over there, they're not part of the community. They don't share the values. They don't have the heritage. They don't have the knowledge. We could have instructed them in the knowledge, but we don't bother, whether they were born here or newly arrived. So we can't assume anything about anyone's knowledge of any aspect of American culture, especially about an athlete from 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. If I say Babe Ruth remains relevant in any sense, what I really mean is he's relevant to me. I can show you how he was directly or indirectly responsible for the modern version of the game, the same version that underpins the baseball we watch today, and maybe that knowledge will add something to your experience of the game, but for most people it would have no impact whatsoever. It would wash over them and be gone. They live entirely in the short moment of their lives and die there too. Lately, as I watch friends spend their middle years in a fruitless panting after career success, I think they never put "pleased his boss" or wrote a bunch of reports at work on anyone's tombstone. All those pathetic little controversies are part of the dumb way we pass the time while we're here, and then they pop like the ephemeral bubbles that they and we are, and no one remembers them. They remember what you leave behind, and to borrow from Stephen Sondheim, I'll say those two things are children and art, and that's about the most accurate thing anyone has ever written about our permanence in this world, or the closest that we can come to it. Now, I'm not saying we don't have to pursue money. That's the world that we live in. I'm saying the little tempests that accompany that pursuit aren't worth the cortisol damage we inflict on ourselves when they occur. The boss ain't worth the inflammation. There's not room on the rock to say, spent 7.5 years fighting with middle manager Tony Ritter before finally quitting and getting a better position. One irony of this is that the free-spirited Babe stands both as a rebuke to taking your own life too seriously and as a victim of doing so because he wasn't immune from getting caught up in those things. He was short-sighted that way, as best exemplified by his long and fruitless quest to become a manager. Put aside the diss that Jacob Rupert and Edward Grant Barrow and others in positions of authority over him used to deny him the job, you can't even manage yourself. Why should we trust you with managing 20-something other people? And ask yourself, why would someone like him even have wanted that job other than out of misplaced ego gratification? He had money, he had freedom, he had a beautiful wife, he had time for leisure when few Americans had any of the foregoing. He was beloved. His second marriage, I just mentioned it, seems to have been a success. He had so little interest in the crowds who surrounded him, including his teammates, that he never bothered to learn their names. Now, was he bored in retirement? Yes, that is the unfortunate fate of many athletes. Many people are, even if they're not. That's on him, though, for not finding something else to do, for becoming singularly focused on the one pastime he could not have. And in that sense, his retirement was one long act of petulance. Ruth had a sense of entitlement about a manager's job, as if hitting 700 home runs was some sort of unshakable prerequisite. Now, on one hand, I will say Joe McCarthy hit exactly 700 fewer major league home runs, having never made the majors, and yet he was spectacularly talented at the job, except, of course, for the cerebral misfire I detailed last week. The point being that what you hit is a category error if you're thinking that that qualifies you to be a leader of men. Not that managers are necessarily that, but someone who can even write out a lineup and keep the pitchers sober. In the Babe's favor, they made Rabbit Moranville a manager. They made every drunk in creation a manager, including Joe McCarthy. You can't even take care of yourself would have applied to the vast majority of dugout practitioners at the time. So it's not an open and closed case in either direction. And certainly, given that when Ruth wanted to do it, it was in the middle of the Great Depression, he would have spun a few turnstiles just taking the lineup card out most days. It seems, though, that they did want to humble him, and he did go about it all sideways. He wanted the Yankees to overthrow McCarthy in his favor, and they weren't going to do that. He blew off the Tigers when their owner was prepared to offer him the job after the 1934 season. He refused the offer to manage the Yankees farm team at Newark, a huge mistake because back then minor league teams weren't just minor league teams. They were competing in their own right, and that club was loaded with talent. He would almost certainly have gotten a major league job had he comported himself with a modicum of professionalism. The Bears were loaded with talent. The 1937 and 1938 teams won over 100 games each, with the result that the manager of the 1937 club, Ossie Witt, who again was terrible, was invited to manage at Cleveland. Terrible at Cleveland, I mean. He did a decent job, apparently, with Newark. His problem was that he went to Cleveland and treated major leaguers as if they were with the Newark Bears, and they weren't going to tolerate that. In fairness to Ruth, baseball could have found an official place for him, if not in the dugout, then somewhere else. And it really is odd how so many owners and league presidents resented and wanted to bite the hand that fed them, even as they paid lip service to how great he was and how much he meant to everybody. Always remember that he had a better time than they did, had more sex than they did, but he never made more money than they did. And still, they hated him. The Yankees couldn't wait to get rid of him. The Braves and Dodgers used him. And when those cons ran their course, the game turned its collective back on him. On yet another hand, it's no one's responsibility to rescue us from ourselves. Sometimes we have friends or loved ones who will make the attempt, but in the end, it's down to us to change our own ways. It seems like the Babe could never do that, devoting his post-playing years to drinking, eating, golf, frequent charitable endeavors, which is a lot, and waiting for the phone to ring about that dugout job. And at some point, you have to quit waiting, throw yourself a lifeline, and move on. In our time, what we used to call culture has become so inextricably linked with consumerism and what you might call stampede capitalism that Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame for everyone seems like a vast overstatement of our patience. We're rushed through the S-curve of everything, shoved pell-mell through introduction, growth, adoption, and then decline, meaning on to the next thing. And that's a lot of what's motivating the current hard press behind AI. Our overlords need the next iPhone gold rush, or everyone's going to have to settle for less than a 10% return on their investments, and our hearts should bleed. There's no time to appreciate what we have before we're pressed to pant after what's coming next. And it's not anything that exciting. The promise isn't the Trumpian, no one's ever seen anything like it, but a self-destructive, celibate indolence that creates nothing, neither children nor art. Babe Ruth's life stands as a rebuke to our current manner of living. As I began these ruminations about the Babe, our current president was in Michigan giving a speech, and he said, "I've done more for you than your parents, okay?" Some people chuckled, many people were offended. But big deal, there are and have been a lot of sub-replacement level parents out there. Ruth's were among them. Caught up in their own marital dysfunction, they stuck him in an orphanage and seemingly forgot about him for the next 15 years. The Zavarian brothers taught him to mend shirts. Yeah, they taught him to play baseball too, but never forget that the shirts were the main thing. They don't seem to have put much effort into socializing him. It's hard to imagine young alternate history Ruth being successful in his tailor shop, cursing in a friendly way, "When do you need your fucking shirt by?" and aggressively hitting on every woman who came in. "Yeah, I have your dress. It's right in the back here. Why don't you come in and take a look at it?" Yet that's what they intended for him. He conquered the world instead. The tailor shop is also the height of what they intend for us. Except we wear the soporifics now. He only sought his out after hours in the speakeasies of the 20s and after 1932, wherever he could find them. The rest of the time, he attended to what he could do better than anyone else. It's our master's intention that we don't attend to anything, that the mill wheel will churn on without its minder, but to what end? It's like Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains, in which all the people have died, but the machines go on, idiotically and pointlessly doing chores for no one. Somewhere Babe Ruth says, screw that. Pick up a bat and swing it for yourself, then get out and have some fun. Knowledge of a life like the Babe's can mediate between us and what we experience. Perhaps it deepens that experience, or perhaps it's a distraction to know that nothing is what it appears to be in and of itself, but is a distillation of 100 million things that came before it. I'd rather know that and try to cope with it and enjoy it where I can. I'd rather be aware of history than be bulldozed by it. Or you can just watch the game and enjoy the home runs and the hamstring pulls. One of my prized possessions is a gift from my wife. It's a photograph taken during World War II of Ted Williams in Red Sox uniform and the Babe in his Yankees suit as they met up for a benefit game. Read the wrong biography of Williams and you'll get the sense that he was surly 24/7 for the entirety of his life, but he is sincerely thrilled to be there next to the Babe. His own massive ego demanded he overthrow the Babe as the best hitter of all time, but that doesn't mean he wasn't having the greatest fan experience of his life. You can't replace that kind of thrill with a virtual experience. And no machine can do it for you. Like Ted in that moment, like the Babe, you have to go out and live it with all the risk and falling down and getting back up that entails. In a column on Ruth's passing, Red Smith quoted him at the end of his life. "I haven't much farther to go," the Babe told his friend Frank Stevens in the hospital. "But I'm not going to die here. I'm going to get out and have some fun first." He was thwarted in that desire, but it's not surprising. That's the story we all tell ourselves as we traverse the short distance from cradle to grave. We spend our time as if the supply will never run out, when all along we had the time to travel only a short distance through the vast gray expanse we call the infinite inning. There and welcome back to the show. Infinite Inning number 386 in an ongoing series. Collect them, trade them, but hold on to them because if you hit a pothole, they'll go flying. That happened to me once in my first car as a teenager. I hit something, the hubcap popped off, and I got sort of a discus throw distance off of that thing. It flew like 3 football fields away before it came down, and I was very fortunate that no one else was hanging out over there, or they might have just gone and lost their heads in a mishap which was caused by a patch of black ice, which even during the daylight was just totally invisible. And who was that impetuous lad who had no idea that one day he'd be speaking to you from behind a microphone when he was behind the wheel at that moment, just hoping to survive and perhaps recover his hubcap? I am your congenial, I'll do both today, host, Stephen Goldman, for this trip to the past on a mission to better understand the present, the time machine, the vehicle as ever being the national pastime, the game of baseball. But as you've already seen, we stop off at a lot of other places along the way. I very much hope that this episode finds you as ever, you and yours, I should say, healthy, wealthy, and well-heeled, or at least 2 out of the 3. Maybe healthy, wealthy, and well-rested. I'm going to move quickly here because the first segment took a lot longer than usual. So we're overdue for a break already. Going back to childhood, the fates, the furies, they're always at my back. Why didn't you do your math homework? Why haven't you taken a break yet? The answer in both cases is the same. I had too much story to tell. I've already told you about Dead Player of the Day. I've tried to keep up the conversation over at Patreon over some other things as we move forward. I will admit that I am badly overbooked for the next couple of weeks, so whatever that is, it might not take off right away. But I will be in there punching, I promise. And while I'm thinking about that, I might as well welcome our latest supporter subscriber who goes by the wonderful handle Fat-Bottomed Mugs Do Make the Coffee More Profound. Yes, it scans, so you can sing it if you want to. And allow me to say this, if what motivates you to go to Patreon and support the show and join our conversation over there is you want to hear me read names like that, then I am all for it. I have no shame. Whatever you call yourself over at Patreon, if you are a new subscriber, I will say it here. Thank you, fat-bottomed mugs. I will note that over at Baseball Prospectus, I did an infinite inning sort of thing in that earlier this week, the Tigers thrashed the Orioles and scored in every inning of the game, which has happened a bunch of times. It doesn't happen often, but it's happened. But what has only happened once before is a team pitching a shutout while doing that. And would you believe, and he's going to show up on the other side of the break too, it's that kind of week, the team that was victimized on September 6th, 1935 by the Pittsburgh Pirates, who scored every inning and pitched a shutout, was Casey Stengel's Brooklyn Dodgers. The shutout itself was pitched by Cy Blanton, who had one really great year and then drank himself off the planet. And that's going to be a bit of a theme today, too. My point in writing that story was to demonstrate that the Dodgers of now, today, the unbeatable juggernaut, are not for all time. The Dodgers can be bad, have been bad, will be bad again, no matter how much money they have to spend. It just happens in 1935 that they didn't have it to spend and they weren't operating on sound principles either. And that too may be true again in the future. On that note, let us finally yield to a break. And on the other side, we will ask, how do you know what's true in history? It's how can you trust a story? And at least part of the answer, and this is a hard one, is you have to know the storyteller. Oh, and also, Mommy, why do we have a trading deadline? When did that start? Well, that's part of this tale too. And once again, an adventure in the life of Casey Stengel, not as a manager this time, but as a player, will help guide us in that department. And so we will go to the New York Giants of the 1920s with not just Casey, but John J. McGraw, a tipsy pitcher named Hugh, and the rest of the gang as they win 4 consecutive pennants. And yeah, the Babe is part of all that too. So please stay with me, have some patience through the break if you don't mind. And on the other side, the Polo Grounds by way of Queens. So how do you even know with history, every story is mediated by the storyteller? Cinderella's mom and stepsisters were terrible people, right? Who told you that? Cinderella? Don't you know she had an axe to grind? How can you explain Cindy and Griselda sharing an apartment together both during and after college? Why is it Cindy introduced Grizz to all her friends at that time as more like a best friend than a stepsister? Why did she not start telling the story we know as Cinderella until 25 years later after Grizz had died in a carriage accident? Who wrote that book about how General Custer was a misunderstood genius who never screwed up and never harmed anybody either? Oh, Mrs. Custer. I get it. The Memoirs of Albert Speer, i.e., I didn't know nothing, I didn't see nothing, I didn't do nothing, I was just the architect. But it's not all personal or related party self-aggrandizement. Sometimes there's an intellectual agenda that's being served because someone wants to believe something so badly that they distort the evidence even for themselves so that they can continue to believe it and will convert you to their cause. It gets lonely being crazy by yourself. Well, here's a tiny baseball version, and as I said, it involves Casey Stengel, but it starts with a hard-drinking pitcher named Hugh. Handsome Hugh, Alvin Hugh McQuillan, Red McQuillan. He was a Brave, a Giant, and then a Brave again. Didn't make it to his 52nd birthday, but this isn't so much about substance abuse as it is about who is friends with who. John and Paul, Simon and Garfunkel, Casey and McGraw. It's also a trade deadline story because the trade deadline is upon us, and it's one of the reasons the deadline exists. Let's start with McQuillan, a man of Queens, New York, born in 1895. I bet he would have enjoyed the Mets, but he couldn't make it. He barely made it to Jackie Robinson, having checked out in August 1947. Not that anyone gets any promises about these things. I'm fudging things just a little about the Queens part, not a lot. One early profile said that he was formerly of Brooklyn, Astoria, and Southampton, Long Island. It was Queens where he grew up, though, and Queens to which he returned when it was all over, and Queens where he died. He was a right-hander, and not terribly memorable, really, as a pitcher. Like many players of his time, he served his apprenticeship on the sandlots of the aforementioned Astoria, joined the semi-pro Empire City Club of Brooklyn, and graduated from there to Toronto of the International League, but he was bounced from that club after 8 games, not for performance reasons as far as I can tell, but probably for drinking. He landed with Worcester of the Eastern League, where in 1917 he pitched a no-hitter against New Haven. The New Haven team, by the way, was called the Merlins, which sounds like a corruption of the Miami team of today or a King Arthur reference, but it wasn't spelled like either one. It wasn't Marlin or Merlin, but Murlin. I haven't been able to figure out what that signifies. If you do, let me know, please. McQuillan's no-hitter was notable in that it was a 1-0 game, and it was the pitcher himself who drove in the winning run. The Braves acquired him in late July 1918. He got a single start, and then they seemingly forgot all about him, perhaps because of the pell-mell rush to the game being shut down due to the First World War. He didn't become a full-time rotation member until 1920. At that time, he went 11-15 with a 3.55 ERA, and that sounds like a decent performance that just lacked run support to make it good, and it might be true to some extent, but we also have to cope with Braves Field being a pitcher's park and the league environment. From 1920 through his departure from Boston at midseason in 1922, and we'll get to that in just a moment, McQuillan went 29-42 with a 3.88 ERA. Now, today we know that one-loss records don't tell anything like the story of a pitcher, and by our standards, that ERA sounds okay, but that's misleading. The NL League ERA did creep up year by year as the lively ball revolution took hold, but McQuillan was still coming in a bit over the league. And then there's the ballpark issue. I've told you this many times, but I hope you don't get bored of hearing it, because I don't get bored of saying it. The lot the Braves had for their ballpark was squeezed between a major thoroughfare and the Charles River. They could have built up close to the road, but the owner said, "Nah, we can lease storefronts up there." And so he backed the park up to the river so he could collect rent from a nail salon, a pizza place, and a Chinese takeout, maybe a dry cleaner, with the result that a cold wind blew in 24/7. He also made the dimensions huge because he liked triples, hated cheap home runs. I don't know what counted as a cheap home run in the dead ball era, but in any case, he didn't get many of either kind, and so it is unsurprising that McQuillan pitched to a 3.24 ERA at home. On the road as a Brave, his ERA was 4.38. And yet, the Giants needed him, and because they needed him, we have a trade deadline. I have told the story of Shufflin' Phil Douglas, the highly erratic Giant spitballer, and how he got himself banned from baseball after his manager, John J. McGraw, abused him terribly over his alcoholism, even having him kidnapped and institutionalized against his will, and then, this is a truly evil touch, sending him the bill for his own unwilling incarceration. After that, Douglas wrote a letter, an inebriated letter threatening to throw games. McGraw and the commissioner, Judge Landis, used that as an excuse to ban him outright. As I've said, I've told this story at length in other episodes. I find McGraw endlessly fascinating, but not necessarily endlessly admirable. The Shuffler's fall came at the end of July 1922 as A, he was leading the National League in ERA, inconvenient that, and B, the Giants were in a close pennant race with the St. Louis Cardinals. Therefore, at about the same moment that Douglas was going away forever, McGraw made a trade with the Braves, getting McQuillan in return for 4 players, and this is key from an appearance point of view, $100,000. The other appearance-type problem is that the Braves, as would often be the case into the 1940s, were owned by New Yorkers. In this case, a Tammany Hall fixer and associate of Giants owner Charles Stoneham. You couldn't say that this was a pure baseball deal, given the cash and the personal association. The Cardinals and their fans were pretty upset, to understate things just a little. Said Braves owner George W. Grant, "It has been a lean year here. We have been fighting to keep out of the cellar, and we've taken in little money at the gate. Do you blame me for parting with 1 pitcher in return for 3 pitchers and an amount of cash which will amply make up all the deficits of the season?" He added, "In fact, few pitchers have been sold for the amount of money I will receive for McQuillan." That was a particularly Trumpian boast. It's like committing arson on yourself and then bragging about the insurance payout even though you've lost your irreplaceable Van Gogh and you're now homeless. A week earlier, the Yankees, in a tight pennant race with the St. Louis Browns. Yeah, that actually happened. The race would end with the 2 teams 1 game apart, 94-60 and 93-61, had made a similarly stinky deal with the Red Sox, the Harry Frazee Red Sox, the indebted to the Yankees Red Sox, and picked up third baseman Jumpin' Joe Dugan in return for a quartet of fungible players and $50,000. Dugan was not a special player, nor was McQuillan, and like McQuillan and Douglas was something of a flake. The Yankees, however, thought their incumbent third baseman, Frank Home Run Baker, was aging out at 36. Although on the day he was benched for what would be the rest of his life, it's important to recall that of the 3 numbers I'm about to give you, the Yankees most likely would have been aware of only the first. He was hitting .286 with a .332 on-base percentage and a .460 slugging percentage. Dugan would hit .286 as well over the rest of the season with a .331 on-base percentage, again almost identical, but only a .365 slugging percentage. He was, however, viewed as being far more spry on defense, and that was probably true. If you will permit, as usual, a short digression, there is one aspect of this shift from the future Hall of Famer Home Run Baker to Jumping Joe Dugan that gets overlooked, I think, in nearly every history, if not all of them. It wasn't just about hitting. It wasn't just about defense. It was about ribs and kidneys. On June 10th at St. Louis, the Browns, just to be clear, since we're talking about both St. Louis teams today, Urban Shocker, then with St. Louis, drilled Baker in the back, almost certainly intentionally. He was hit immediately after the Babe hit a 2-run shot off of Shocker. It didn't seem like a serious thing at first. Baker stayed in the game, ran the bases and scored, and then batted again in the top of the 4th and hit an RBI single. At that point, though, he had to come out and was taken to the hospital. It seemed at first as if Baker had suffered rib or kidney damage. I can only imagine that swelling set in, and as he was running up the line to first, he was suddenly straining to breathe, or possibly he hit the men's room and bled in a way that is really upsetting if you've never experienced before. Actually, it's pretty upsetting when you have experienced it before. At the risk of giving you too much information as a chronic sufferer of kidney stones, I am all too familiar with the possibilities here, even though I have never been hit by a pitch offered by Urban Shocker. Shocker was one of the best pitchers of this period, and 5 years on, he would be the best pitcher on the 1927 Yankees. That was the end of his career, though, and soon after the end of his life due to heart problems. He was a 4-time 20-game winner with the Browns, for gosh sakes, and with one more half-decent season, he would have won over 200 games and possibly gone into the Hall of Fame. He could also be kind of a jerk, and he definitely was one in this game. Hitting Baker after Ruth homered, as I said, is pretty transparent, and I can say definitively there was intention, not just because of the timing or because I'm reading a dead pitcher's mind 104 years later, but because he then threw at the heads of pitcher Carl Mays and leadoff man Whitey Witt as well, both of whom charged the mound, the latter while swinging his bat. Somehow, diminutive Yankees manager Miller Huggins deflected Mays in the first instance, and Huggins and umpire Billy Evans wrestled Witt away in the second, and no one was assaulted or ejected. And although I believe that the cops ran out onto the field as well as the players during the second incident, the attitude at the time was more, boys will be boys, and they just rolled on. Now, x-rays suggested Baker's innards were okay. He missed a couple of days, started 3 more games, and that was when he hit the bench forever, but not because Dugan was acquired. That wouldn't happen for another 6 weeks. Again, that might purely have been because Baker was so visibly slowing down in his mid-30s that the Yankees felt like he had to sit, even though they didn't have a permanent replacement on hand. Initially, they went with a light-hitting middle infielder, but it seems to me that it's reasonable to suspect the lingering influence of that injury. Maybe it was a Giancarlo Stanton thing, he'll be fine after a couple of days. And the next thing you know, he's been out for 90 of them, and at last report was in traction at a secret location. Either way, it must have seemed like there was an anti-St. Louis conspiracy going on in New York, financed by New York Capital, and that is why, after this season, the old June 15th non-waiver trading deadline was inaugurated. Impotent rage is called that for a reason. The Yankees got Dugan and won the pennant. The Giants got handsome Hugh McQuillan and won the pennant, although, knowingly or unknowingly, in replace and shuffle and fill with handsome Hugh, they had simply swapped in one merry wanderer of the night with another. Not that Douglas was so merry. McQuillan was, it seems, a happier drinker, given to pranks. The Giants then, supposedly, exacerbated this tendency by rooming him with their platoon center fielder, Charles Dillon Stengel, known to the world as Casey. Now, on the pitching side, McQuillan went from a team that was about average in defensive efficiency, with no standout gloves in the infield, kind of the opposite, to the league-leading team in defensive efficiency. He was now pitching in front of George Kelly, Frankie Frisch, Heine Groh, and Dave Beauty Bancroft, and it's not unreasonable to think that all 4 of them at times in their career would have been Gold Glove winners had that award existed at the time. Predictably, he dropped a half run off his ERA while being roughly the same pitcher in all other respects. He went 6-5 the rest of the way. As I said, the Giants won the pennant by 7 games over Cincinnati, not the Cardinals, who faded and finished 4th. He also started World Series Game 4 against the Yankees, beating them and Carl Mays, who pitched 8 shutout innings around a 4-run 4th that made Huggins suspicious that the gamblers had gotten to him. McQuillan held Babe Ruth to a walk. He later said McGraw had called every pitch. He later explained McGraw stood in the dugout holding a bat. If the right hand was on top, he said, a fastball. The left hand, a curveball. Both hands down the bat, a changeup. Bat across hands, a slow curve. All curveballs into the dirt at Ruth's feet. When Ruth popped up for the second time in the 8th inning of that game, McQuillan shouted at him, "Is that all you can do? Hit pop-ups?" You gotta watch out for Zeus when saying things like that, because he has this thing about hubris. Wrote syndicated sports writer John B. Foster, by selecting McQuillan, McGraw put his finger on the type of player that represented youth and strength, which is the type that usually puts something over these days when pitchers are so hard to find and worth so much more than they used to be. That seems like complete gibberish to me. I've read it many more times than I've read it to you, but that's what I have for contemporary commentary. I apologize. They weren't all Ring Lardner back then, and hell, by 1922, even Ring Lardner might not have been Ring Lardner anymore. Dude still had his chops, though. Pull out the golden honeymoon when you have a chance. In fact, you should do it now, during this brief break, this quick interstitial. And on the other side, we will continue the story of Hugh McQuillan and the mid-1920s Giants. I hope you're having as much fun as I am. Babe Ruth had his revenge on Hugh McQuillan the next year when the two teams again matched up. It was the 3rd consecutive World Series between the Yankees and Giants. The Giants won the first 2. McQuillan had gone 15-14 with a 3.41 ERA. Do you remember the old debunked stat, wins above team? This again goes to a pitcher's 1-loss record, which is not really indicative of very much, although it meant a little more back then when pitchers tended to complete their games. But again, it doesn't say anything about run support or defense or the pitcher's efficiency, really, but McQuillan would not have shown well by that statistic given that the Giants were just a little over 500 when he pitched, but were a 90-plus win team when he did not. He did pitch and start Game 2 of the World Series and was chased in the fourth. Aaron Ward and, yes, the Babe, homering off of him. The Babe then hit a second shot against reliever Jack Bentley. Zeus had taken a hand, you see. 2 days later, McQuillan came on in relief of Jack Scott, who McGraw pulled in the second due to the Yankees blasting line drives off of him, the walls, his mom. He allowed McQuillan, that is, 2 runs in 5 1/3 innings, which was pretty good compared to the other pitchers the Giants used that day, but it wasn't enough. The Yankees went on to win the series, the first in their history, and they've nary won another since, or at least not since 2009. The Giants then won their 4th consecutive pennant in 1924, while the Yankees stayed home. McQuillan had his best year with them, sort of. He pitched to a 2.69 ERA in 184 innings, which was good, but he was suspended for, quote, breaking training rules, which generally should be read as intoxication after curfew or before a game or both, hence the low innings total. We will get some specificity on what he did to get himself suspended in just a moment. However, he did start Game 3 of the World Series against your Washington Senators and somehow got credit for the win, despite allowing 2 runs in 3 2/3 innings. Official scorers, what are you gonna do? He pitched a scoreless inning and 2/3 in Game 5 and earned a save, not that that was a formal thing at the time, and finally pitched another scoreless inning and 2/3 in a 3-3 tie in Game 7, helping get that into extra innings, but the Giants lost it in 12. That was the end of both McQuillan's and McGraw's postseason careers. It was all downhill for almost everyone involved after that. In 1925, McQuillan missed time after cutting open the thumb on his pitching hand when the frame holding his girlfriend's picture broke as he was removing it from his suitcase. And if you believe that, well, his ERA for the season was 6.04. Girlfriend is a little interesting because he was married at the time, albeit in the process of getting divorced. His wife was Nellie T. McQuillan of Elmhurst, Queens. The girlfriend, who was named in the divorce, was Miss Helene Goebel of the Bronx. In fact, a Miss Bronx of the Bronx in some beauty contest or another. Mrs. McQuillan, who was suing for separation, not divorce because of her Catholicism, averred that her husband had become addicted to wild parties, a habit from which neither the pleadings of his mother nor high fines by the Giants management have been able to break him. Her affidavit mentioned one party which lasted 6 days. Mrs. McQuillan said that the marriage, which had been made in 1917, had been happy for about 5 years, but that when Hugh got to the Giants and started earning better money, he went off the rails. I quote, "Gay parties, women and intoxicants have transformed him into a brute, a habitual drunkard, and an unfeeling sot." I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that if your wife is, under oath, referring to you as a sot, that it's probably too late to try marriage counseling. Her affidavit says that in 1924, again, remember, McQuillan was suspended back then, the Giants were engaged in a, quote, crucial series when she said, "My husband left his home on a Friday morning with a woman and another couple, despite the fact that he was to pitch for his club on the following day. I have since found out that they visited various roadhouses." She said that the incident cost him a $500 fine, plus he forfeited a $2,000 bonus. He later remarried not Helene Goebel, Miss Bronx, but Gladys Nelson, a member of the chorus of the Broadway show Sweet Adeline by Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern, with its hit song, "Why Was I Born?" Additional questions asked by the song, "Why am I living? What do I get? What am I giving? Why do I want a thing I daren't hope for? What can I hope for? I wish I knew. Why do I try to draw you near me? Why do I cry? You never hear me. I'm a poor fool, but what can I do? Why was I born? To love you." No, that is where you are going wrong, Miss Billie Holiday, Miss Helen Morgan. Cut it out. Quit it, Ella Fitzgerald. Get wise already. He's not that into you. Gladys and Hugh had 2 kids together. As for the original Mrs. McQuillan, she was granted $500 a month in alimony. Hugh stiffed her. He rebounded the next year, at least on the mound. You'd be shocked how many off years are precipitated by a divorce. Going 11-10 with a 3.72 ERA in 167 innings, his workhorse days were over, if indeed he ever had them. He sagged badly in 1927, however, and McGraw finally gave up and sent him back to Boston in return for 3 players. It was kind of a sweet deal because one of them was Larry Benton, a pitching prospect who had been in the original 1922 McQuillan deal, studied up while he was with the Braves, served his apprenticeship, and then returned to the Giants and went 25-9 with a 2.73 ERA in 310 innings. McQuillan was done. He pitched poorly for the Braves, spent 3 years bouncing around the upper minors, including pitching for his former roommate Casey at Toledo. Finally, he went back to Queens, got some sort of job on the municipal payroll, and as I said earlier, his life ended fairly young in 1947 after a 6-month hospitalization for cancer of some kind. Curiously, the paper said that he was never aware of what was about to kill him. To return, though, to McQuillan and Casey, his roommate. Hugh didn't carouse with Casey. His running mate was fellow pitcher Jesse Barnes. McGraw, unamused, referred to them sarcastically as Gallagher and Sheehan, after the then-famous vaudeville team. Absolutely, Mr. Gallagher? Positively, Mr. Sheehan. If Casey went out at night, it was more typically with his co-outfielder, Irish Musel. Stengel used to joke that McGraw saved a few bucks by assigning one detective to the pair of them, so he stopped going out with Irish. When McGraw asked if the two had had a falling out, Casey said, "No, I don't want to share a detective with anyone else. I want one of my own." In 1935, a columnist named George A. Barton wrote the above story in support of his assertion that, and I quote, Casey Stengel, colorful manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, never got along amicably with John McGraw when he played with the Giants because Casey couldn't bring himself to kowtowing to the little Napoleon in the matter of sham respect. He added that McGraw was even more aggravated when he learned that Stengel had protected Huey McQuillan, another playboy, by imitating Huey's voice from behind a hotel bedroom door when McGraw's detective made his regular midnight round of the players' rooms. McQuillan was out all night, McGraw learned later. Now, Casey used to tell this story himself. Here's how John Lardner related it in Newsweek in 1935. When McQuillan worked for John J. McGraw and the New York Giants, he shared a room at one time with Casey Stengel, later a manager and a highly respectable character. "I wasn't always so respectable," says Casey. "When I roomed with McQuillan, I used to wish I could get out at night and play hide-and-seek with McGraw's detectives. But McQuillan kept me honest because I had to be in the room at midnight to answer his name on the roll call. McGraw had a system about that time where his chief detective would go around the hotel at midnight knocking on your door. When he said, 'Stengel,' I would sing out, 'Here,' in my baritone voice. Then he would say, 'McQuillan?' and I would yell, 'Here,' in my tenor voice. There was never a dull moment. Since becoming a manager," adds Mr. Stengel cautiously, "I've seen the error of those wild ways. If any of my boys stay out all night, I will probably find their ears off. It's all in the point of view." Now, I have no doubt that McGraw was frustrated. Huey can be just as great a pitcher as he wants to be, McGraw said, but I don't think he wants to be. He doesn't take the game seriously enough. I had such a strong feeling of deja vu saying that to you just now because I heard it roughly daily, grades K through 12 inclusive, from my teachers. As for McGraw, his intention in rooming Hugh with Casey wasn't to give the former an accomplice after the fact. It was to place a bibulous 26-year-old with a 31-year-old who, while hardly abstemious, had already gone through his youthful hell-raising period. It was in the past, he wasn't a problem drinker, and he was on the verge of getting married. Now, Casey had a legendary tolerance, which means he either drank less than people thought he did, sort of like Bruce Wayne at a party, or he really did just have a very efficient liver into his old age. I'll tell you this, though, he lived to be 85, and it wasn't cirrhosis that killed him. Smoking maybe, but not cirrhosis. That Casey didn't want to be a spy for management shouldn't have been a surprise to McGraw, and I very much doubt it was a surprise. He did get in trouble for it, though. It almost got him bounced from the ball club, if his memoirs are accurate. After doing his voice acting bit to cover for McQuillan in Chicago, Casey said, after McQuillan did get back, he evidently became sick, and he forgot to clean it up in the morning. Great roommate, that Hugh McQuillan. The maids reported it, and I got blamed for it. And when we came to leave town, Jesse Barnes and Earl Smith and myself were told that we'd been traded over to the Boston Braves. Judge Fuchs, the Boston owner, was right there at the station platform. He told Smitty he was going to give him a raise. He told Barnes he was going to give him a raise, and he said the same thing to me. Earl Smith was a catcher who could hit, but he also drank, and he and McGraw hated each other. McGraw called Smith an anarchist. The trade, though, did happen, mostly. On June 7th, 1923, Barnes and Smith were traded to the Braves for catcher and war hero Hank Gowdy and pitcher Mule Watson. Casey wasn't in that trade, though. Why? I said, "You're not going to give me any raise. I'm staying on this ball club." And I got right on the train and found an empty berth and rode to Pittsburgh. The next day, when I went out to the ballpark, over came Dick Rudolph, who had pitched on the Braves and was now a coach on the team. He said, "We'll give you $1,000 raise. We'll give you $1,500. We'll give you $2,000. We'll give you $3,000. That's the last and biggest money you're going to get, and you'd better take it." I said, "I'm not going to join you." And I went and I saw Mr. McGraw and convinced him. So I didn't go to Boston then, although I did get traded there later on. You see, Casey had spent a lot of his career in the second division, particularly during some ill-fated trades to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and he hated it, and he lost interest. He was meant to play in Brooklyn and New York and to manage the Yankees. He was engaged in those places, and so he knew better than allow himself to be given away in that manner. And this is key to what I'm about to tell you. McGraw valued him enough on multiple levels that he was willing to be persuaded, but only for so long. And when it changed, when Casey was traded to Boston, it was for baseball reasons. It happened after the 1923 World Series. Casey was actually New York's best player in that World Series, but he was getting old and injury prone. So despite the postseason heroics, he was dealt to Boston. "The paths of glory lead only to the Braves," he grumbled. But he spent the rest of his life speaking admiringly of McGraw, though he bristled when people said that he imitated him. After McGraw had died, his wife dictated a book called The Real McGraw to sports writer Arthur Mann, and she talked about how McGraw used to bring Casey home at night. They'd talk baseball into the early a.m., and then before dawn, Casey would scramble eggs for him. Yes, McGraw traded him away because baseball transcends personal loyalty, and oh boy did Casey learn that lesson well. It was one of the secrets to his success. Moving him out wasn't about animosity. In fact, it was McGraw who encouraged Casey to keep being himself because he livened up a team, and it was McGraw who set him up in his first managerial jobs. He gave him the B squad to run in spring training when he was with the Giants, and he set him up with a high-profile managerial job in the minors at Toledo. Casey had a very long run there, and that helped spur his trip back to the majors with the Dodgers, first as a coach for Max Carey in 1932 and 1933, and then as the manager himself. And it's a real shame that McGraw died in February 1934, too soon to see Casey become a major league manager that year. That's not to say that Casey got along with him all the time, but no one got along with McGraw all the time. He was an irascible personality, particularly as he aged, but I do think it's fair to say that he got along with him about as well as any player could have at that stage of McGraw's life. And McGraw showed that there was mutual appreciation there through various gestures. So I'm not sure where that columnist I began with got the idea that McGraw had soured on Casey just because Casey tried to protect McQuillan from getting in trouble. And maybe I'm reading into things too much, but the language of that column about Casey not kowtowing to McGraw out of sham respect certainly seems like that of a writer who had the attitude that McGraw, at least at that point, was a martinet who demanded respect without necessarily commanding it or earning it, and he's using Casey as an example to fit that case. I recently ran into someone who watches way too much of the wrong kind of news broadcast. I'll leave it at that. They hit me with a revisionist history of the last 10 or so years, including and especially the pandemic, based on a congressional hearing that happened the other day. I got both barrels. The whole Chinese conspiracy thing, Fauci is a mass murderer, just a lot of nonsense that's propaganda designed to obscure how badly mishandled the whole thing was by the government, then in charge and in charge again, new and disproved, new and devolved, and also the deep, deep offense taken by self-serving libertarian types who, a half dozen years later, remain offended that they were asked to alter their behavior just a bit so that the most vulnerable among us didn't die. That's my take on that history. This other feller's, his take is very different. We both lived through the same thing, and in part because of after-the-fact confirmation of his biases, came away with very different stories and understandings. Whether Casey Stengel was friends with John McGraw or not doesn't matter very much in the grand scheme of things. It matters quite a bit in baseball history, insofar as getting it wrong would be to misunderstand a great many championship baseball seasons, including 4 Giants and 10 Yankees pennants. So this story is just a warning then, to make sure that when someone tells you a story, you inquire into their motives just a bit, because they may well have gotten it wrong, whether innocently or cynically. And once they spin you around that way, you might never find your way back onto the map that corresponds to reality and the community of shared interests. A lot of fuss over a very minor pitcher, but then the trade deadline is often like that, overpromising and under-delivering. And speaking of overpromising and under-delivering, you might have heard about social media, where you can join me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. Leave your feet at home, please. But should you wish to support the show like the Fat Bottom Mugs fella, I'm so appreciative of that, then please go to patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show gain attention. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, pull an ice cream sandwich out of the fridge, intend to eat only half of it, but consume all of it without really thinking things through, because that's what I did earlier tonight. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "Come, send round the wine and leave points of belief to simpletons, sages, and reasoning fools." Now wait a minute, that was Dr. Mooring or Thomas More, the guy who flogged reasoning fools and then got beheaded for being a reasoning fool? The whole thing seems ill-omened to me, but if we can avoid the same fate, then I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.